Grief is real, big, better shared. The podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear.
I'm Diane Brockmeyer, the CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who choose to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to help bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Grief support is especially meaningful to me, as it was a tremendous help to my daughter, who lost her dad when she was 7 years old. 20 years later, she still recalls the positive, safe feelings she had with her grief support group. They understood her. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance. For more information about becoming a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. I'm Angela Hamblin-Kelly, the administrator of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, and we're so glad that you are tuning in today. If this is your first time checking out our podcast, please know that we have Season 1 available wherever you get your podcast. In Season 1, there's a lot of great content about grief in general, about spouse loss, men in grief, and important things to know about childhood and adolescent grief. So make sure you go back and catch up on those episodes. With Season 2, we've heard from you and we listened to you, and we're going to focus more on some specific topics in a very short format. Just as a reminder, the Baptist Centers for Good Grief has been providing grief care for over 25 years. We've grown from a children's grief camp to a program with 3 comprehensive grief centers in Tennessee and Arkansas. We started this podcast because grief is the most universal experience there is. Again, this is the podcast everyone needs to hear because grief involves pain and vulnerability, which is also why this is the podcast nobody wants to hear. So I sit here today as a grief counselor, but I'm also a griever. So in our podcast, we hope to honestly look at grief and discuss the heart and head tug of war from an evidence-based grief counseling perspective, but also the very real-life perspective as well. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about some common myths and facts about grief. This is so important because the world out there likes to give us so many mixed messages about grief. And we have talked about so many times in these episodes that grieving is a highly individual experience. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. It's important to be kind and gentle with ourselves when we're grieving. So we are going to just jump in and start talking about some myths. And to do that today, I'm joined with Erin, one of our grief counselors. So Erin, thanks so much for being here.
Of course, happy to be here.
So we know, we've talked about it's important to be kind and gentle, and grief is just so different for so many people. But there's some places to start with myths, and I always tell people we have to sort of just talk about the basics of grief to understand it so that we can begin to heal. And if we don't know what it is, we can't heal.
Right, exactly.
So I'm going to throw one out to you that I hear a lot. And
sure.
So this is a myth that the pain will go away faster if you just ignore it.
Oh, how we wish this were true.
Right.
Well, you can try to ignore it, and some people certainly have, but I think they would tell you that it just comes to the surface later. Mm-hmm. Your grief will not be ignored forever, and so it's going to pop up. And, you may feel it more in your body or through other ways, of speaking to you besides just, your emotions. But your grief is going to speak to you. So just, make sure that you're paying attention.
Yes. And giving it time and space, which I think we've talked about a lot here.
So here's another one that we hear a lot. Time heals all wounds.
Oh, grieving people love being told that.
Right?
Or yes. So time is just thrown around so much out there. And I had a client the other day just say it so great. She said, it doesn't get better. I'm not going to say that, but it gets different. And I thought that was really interesting. But what really matters is what we do with the time.
Right.
So, time heals all wounds. Well, if we are working, if we're actively mourning, grief demands attention. We say that all the time. So if we are truly spending time with our grief, finding ways of active mourning, then our grief does change, as my client says. It may feel a little lighter at times, a little easier to carry at times, but grief, we know, comes in waves, and that grief lasts forever. Right. So a lot of times I think when people hear that message, they still are waiting for that sense of finality. Like, okay, well, good. Well, how much time? 3 months?
Right.
6 months? Yeah.
There's going to be an end.
Right. And so speaking of that it's going to be an end, a kind of another myth is that, grieving lasts a year. You're going to grieve a year, 12 months. Right. All better.
All better. Right. Oh, man. I had this conversation with a couple of clients yesterday about how people in their lives expected them, it's been a year, it's been over a year, then you should be better. And occasionally some people do find some relief at the end of a year because they're like, well, I've gotten through all the firsts and, they may feel a little better, but certainly their grief is not gone and they still have more of the process. What I find more often is that people expect to feel a positive feeling at the end of a year and they don't understand why, because we all have this cultural idea in our mind of a year. And so they feel disappointed in themselves. They feel like they've failed. Yes. They have other people in their lives basically telling them they're not grieving right. And I have to tell them, no, this process lasts as long as it lasts, and it's never really over. It just changes. It gets different. So that self-compassion with yourself, how you're doing is how you're doing, whether it's been a year or 2 or 3, where you're at with your grief is where you're at.
And we know that a lot of times there can be a sense of regression as people get into year 2, because like you said, kind of that first year, everybody's like holding on, like, okay, I made it through all the first. And then I usually try to warn people when they experience that first thing for the second time. That's a lot of times when people are like, oh, this is really my new reality.
I hear that so often where it's like the second year, the second events of that year are harder than the first because the shock has worn off and a lot of times the support has dropped off and you're like, wow, this is real, this is the way it's going to be. And that's hard. So another myth is expressing intense grief emotions is a sign of weakness or losing control.
So I'm literally rolling my eyes at that one because if you're listening, I want you to hear you should experience intense grief emotions. Remember, we talk about the 5 different ways we grieve. They're common, normal. You should be experiencing grief reactions.
Yes.
It is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of grief, which is a reflection of love.
Yes.
So we don't like it. I don't want to have these different emotions. I certainly don't want the intensity. I don't want the intensity when I'm at the grocery store or when I'm at work trying to be productive. And that's the part that is really hard, but it is certainly not a sign of weakness. Your grief is a reflection of your love. And I think with that, we have to talk about crying. Our culture just looks at crying as weak or, more of a feminine trait or things like that. And you're crying because your grief has shattered your heart. You weren't asked for this. This happened to you. And tears, there's actually a ton of research that shows all of the many, many benefits
Yes.
for your body physically and cognitively when you do let those tears flow.
Yes.
I think another thing with that is sometimes we work really hard to protect other people around us. And sometimes that message that, oh, don't do that, be strong, be strong. I really think our world, our culture needs to rework what strong is and what strong
Yes.
really means. But it's oftentimes when it's used, it's such a way to shut people down.
Yes, absolutely. And, I love what you said about protecting people. I run across that all the time. Different family relationships. They say, well, I don't want to cry because I don't want to make mom sad.
Right.
Or I don't want to cry because I don't want the kids to worry that I'm not doing okay. And what we say to that is that you can explain to them the benefits of crying. You can explain to them, I'm having a hard grief day and I'm crying because that's what you do when you're sad, or that's a normal reaction to have. And it's okay for you to do it too. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. It's just an expression of our grief. And then, we'll be able to finish crying and kind of move on to the next thing. And just normalizing that in the family. You don't have to just cry and be upset and not explain to them what's going on. You can kind of guide them, the people around you, to a better understanding and a healthier relationship with crying.
So that leads to another myth talking about crying, because there's also, if you don't cry, it means that you're not sad.
Right. Yes. Yes. And one thing that I think we really want to communicate is there's no right or wrong way to grieve or feel emotions or express emotions. The important part is just that you're listening to your grief and that you're expressing how you need to. So if you're not a person who cries a lot, if you don't naturally have, tears coming out when you're sad, or any sort of emotional expression that people might expect from you, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong. You're a unique individual who's going to experience your grief in a unique way. The important part is just, if you are sad, what is a way that you can express it if you're not crying? Because we want you to have a way to let it out. So there are other ways that you can do that.
Right.
You can talk to people in your life that support you. Just talking it out helps a lot of people. You can do artistic expression or listen to songs that help you get your sadness out. There's so many ways that you can express that sadness other than crying.
And I think it's important to note too about maybe not crying is that sometimes grief overload can really prevent people from crying. So if people have had multiple losses back to back, if it's a traumatic loss, and sometimes that actually prevents the tears because of the intensity of the trauma, or maybe the avoidance factors that can be healthy when you're experiencing something like that.
Right.
And the other thing maybe with not crying is, again, we've talked about this in other episodes, grief puts so much on your plate.
Yes.
And if all of a sudden now maybe you're a single parent because your spouse has died and you have 3 kids, there are literal tasks that have to be done. And that stuff is going to take priority.
Yes.
I've got to feed the children. We have clean clothes for school. And so sometimes there can be delayed grief that we see with people. And so that might be where the tears come too, because of the situations going on around.
Absolutely. So if you haven't been crying for a while and then all of a sudden you start to feel, this sadness and the tears come, there's also nothing wrong with that either.
Right.
If you're like, it's been 2 years and suddenly I'm crying a lot, well, you probably just had all of these other things that you needed to process and that were getting in the way. And now that you have the time and space for the tears to come.
And just another thought about that, I had a client recently, they had finished up a trial, and the whole family had been having this conversation about crying because none of them had really been crying. But it was once that was kind of taken care of, they were really surprised by how the tears were just coming all the time. And
Right.
they said it felt like, that the loss just happened. Or you said music earlier. A lot of times people can be kind of surprised or kind of have a wave of grief if they're somewhere and all of a sudden they hear a song that they weren't expecting.
Yes,
So
that
yeah.
happens so often. Yeah. So, kind of a flip side of that is there's a myth that moving forward in your life means that you're forgetting about your loss. So when we're moving from that emotional state to maybe not as emotional, or, things are just changing as time goes on, that we're forgetting.
So many of these myths that are out there that we believe to be true are just so laced with so much guilt.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yes. And we hear that specifically about this one, about if I'm moving forward, I'm forgetting. Even with children, we hear this like, oh, I'm, having such a good time, or I'm really looking forward to this dance. Does that mean I'm forgetting my mom? We're still living, we are still living, and we still have purpose and meaning and value for being on this earth. And we look at that as, we talk about that through reconciliation, that it's a very healthy part of our grief is learning, how do I reconcile this loss, this grief into my life? How do I carry it with me? Not pack it up and leave it somewhere else, but how do I live with purpose, meaning, and value, and do my grief work and remember?
Right. And that's so many things to juggle and balance, right? And so it's gonna take time to figure out. And it's, again, going back to that self-compassion. You are doing things at your own pace and how you're doing them. But, again, like you said, you're still living. It's so important to have those moments of joy, to have those things to look forward to. That's going to be a part of, moving forward into the future. It has to be.
It has to be. And I think that's where, again, good grief work, you can learn about memorialization and how you can maybe include acts of memorialization for maybe really large, big events in your life. I was just thinking about high school graduation. A lot of times we'll hear from some of our former kids, like, oh gosh, it's so weird to be graduating from high school and my mom's not going to be here. Well, how do you carry your mom with you that night when you get that diploma? I mean, that is what reconciliation is, and that's what healthy grief and mourning is. It's when your grief goes with you, but you're still living with joy.
Absolutely. And, another thing is humor. And I can't tell you how many times, grief sessions will end in just uproarious laughter. And you're like, how can that happen in a grief counseling session? Well, it's because a great coping skill is humor. Yes. And so, there are things to still laugh about and joke about. And you can make light of a heavy situation how you need to sometimes, because that's another way that we get through.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned humor, because it does help us. One, it helps us with myths, because again, people come at us with so many things that are kind of, a reflection of themselves. And you think to yourself, did they just say that to me? Like, they have no idea, And so you're right. A lot of times clients will even come in and say, I have a new something that somebody said to me that is just like, why would they do this? And so humor can be very healing as well, for sure.
Yes.
So, well, Erin, thank you for joining me today and helping us talk about some of these myths. Again, I think it's just so important to help people know what grief really is.
Yes.
And, maybe how to kind of navigate some of these messages they get from others.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. But like we've said, grief demands attention and care. It also needs support and patience. Remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. You are not alone. The world is full of many grievers like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, know that you can reach out and let us know if there's a topic that you're interested in learning more about. You're welcome to email me at angela.kelly at bmhcc.org. That's ANGELA.KELLY at bmhcc.org. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. We'll talk soon.